Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. I want to start out by thanking David for giving me the chance to talk to you all this morning. What I'm going to be talking about is a Reformation church history tour that was put on by Westminster that Lynn and I got to be part of. And I thought long and hard about how to do this, but I think I'm going to start by going through the sites as we saw them in, or the order we saw them in, which is not chronological historical order, but it gives some structure. And then I'm going to go back and we're going to use this handout you've got to help understand some of the Reformation pieces along the way. So we'll be going over this chart when we're about halfway through today. But the other thing is, since the word Reformation is in this talk, I thought it would be helpful to just go over a little bit about what I'm talking about when we're talking about Reformation. So there's some controversy a little bit as to when Reformation starts and ends, but most people would say when Luther put the 95 Theses on the door of Wittenberg Castle in 1517, that was kind of the start of the Reformation. And what followed after that was a rapid period of Reformation as it swept across all the churches and communities of Europe, and then there was a confessional period, so-called, during which people started to say, well, let's put down what we really believe. And that's the time that we got things like the Belgic Confession and the Heidelberg Confession and the Westminster Confession grew out of that confessional period. Now, what underlaid some of the dissatisfaction that people had with the Catholic Church at that time, number one, there was corruption in the church on many, many different levels, and there was a growing wealth in the church, despite the fact that many people who were in the church had given vows of poverty. On a purely spiritual basis, there were some real causes that differentiated people in the Catholic Church from people in the Reformation. The first was that Rome strongly believed that there were other intermediaries between us and God besides Christ. So you have the Virgin Mary, you have saints that people were praying to. Secondly, there was no assurance of salvation. In the Catholic Church, you could never be convinced that you were going to be saved because not only was there Jesus' work, but there's other stuff you had to do. How did you live your life? Did you go to confession? Did you have unconfessed sin? How were you doing on penance? And the other things the church wanted you to do. Thirdly, and this was especially true in Germany, there was the practice of indulgences whereby buying something, by giving money to the church, you were somehow forgiving your sins or lessening your time in purgatory. Fourthly, the Catholic Church would say that they believed in Scripture, but they would say equally so, or maybe more so, that what the Pope said or what church councils said or what, quote, the church said was equal or maybe even more important than what Scripture said. And lastly, and I'm leaving, this isn't a complete list, but just to give you an idea of some of the underlying themes. Lastly, there was a huge difference in the way the Reformed people and the Catholics looked at sacraments. Most basically, how many were there? A lot of Reformed people say just 2. A lot of Catholics would say 7, but also the meaning of the individual sacraments, like, for example, at communion, what's happening. A Roman Catholic person would say that the bread and the wine actually becomes the body and blood of Christ. Whereas Lutherans and Protestants wouldn't say that. So, really quick survey through Reformation just to give you a little background for what people were talking about. And with that, we're going to jump in. So, and I may stand, well, let me see if they can still see me over here. Yes, okay. Of course, the keyboard's here. We'll work it out. All right, so this is a tour that was put on by Westminster, and these were the 4 main speakers. And every one of them either is currently or used to be a professor at Westminster. So Dr. Peter Lobach is the current president. He's stepping down in December. Dr. David Garner, if any of you have gone to a seminary on Saturday, he's the number 2 man and he's becoming president in September. Dr. Todd Rester was here a year and a half ago. He's a church history professor. And Dr. Stafford Carson is very prominent in the Irish Presbyterian Church and has been on faculty at Westminster several times. He actually preached here too. Some of you may have heard him a year and a half ago. And then Dr. Sinclair Ferguson was on the faculty for, 10 years maybe, David? 15 years in the 80s and 90s. He's now with Ligonier and he's been with RTS and some other places. So these were the 5 main speakers. We also had the privilege, because of their connections We got to meet Rico Tice. I don't know if any of you know that name, but he was one of the co-creators of Evangelism Explored, which is an evangelistic study out of Mark. He's been doing that for 30 years. And another man named Dan Strange, who you may have read a book he wrote on the 5 magnetic connection points. It's basically how you can connect with someone who's not a believer by the basic needs that people have, that anyone has. So that kind of expanded our experience. So this is a map, and real quickly, we flew into Edinburgh and started, I think you're supposed to roll the R, Edinburgh, and stayed there for 3 days, 2 days in Edinburgh, and one day we took a day trip to St. Andrews. And then the next day we went down to Lindisfarne and stayed at Newcastle, and the next day we went to Whitby and stayed at York, and the next day we went to Boston Ely and stayed at Cambridge, and then we went to London for 3 nights, and the last day we took a day trip to Oxford. So that's kind of our route. And now I'm going to just talk about each of those. Are we doing okay, Sally? I have this habit of mumbling, I know. So I just went over there. We're going to save time. So first place we got into was Edinburgh, and the day we got there, we had a dinner the first afternoon, and we were sitting in a restaurant and looking out the back window. This is the back of Edinburgh Castle. The Magnificent Mile starts on the other side and goes down about a mile to Holyrood Palace, which is on the other end, but this is kind of the back side of the castle. Some of you, I'm going to back up, yeah. So the 2 days that we were in Edinburgh, we visited some sites. Those pictures are all the same place. This is separated from this by a couple hundred yards. This is Greyfriars Church, and that's important because in 1638, that's where the Scottish Covenant was signed. And that was hundreds of people who were pastors and preachers and lords and other prominent people who got together and signed a covenant where they agreed to accept basically kind of Reformed beliefs. Subsequent to that, many of those people were persecuted, even into the 1680s and 1690s. And there were people who, on the grounds of Greyfriar, were imprisoned and died for their faith because of their adherence to the Protestant. In front of that, about 100 yards away, is Greyfriars Bobby. That's a name for dog. This is the faithful Bobby dog who went and sat on his master's grave for 14 years after he died. Yeah, and it's good luck to rub his nose. That's why the nose is shiny, because everyone rubs his nose. Okay. So that was on Saturday. Sunday morning, we went to a church called St. Columba's, which is on the Magnificent Mile, and we had the privilege of hearing the sermon being given by Sinclair Ferguson. And any of you who are old-time Christ Pres people might recognize, well, this is of course Lynn and me, and this is Rachel Brooks, and this is Jeannie Carroll Cox. If you remember back to the early 2000s, she was part of the youth team, and she was on that trip as kind of Rachel's traveling partner. It was really good to get to know her. Okay. The other important thing in Edinburgh is it's the site where John Knox preached. And John Knox, we could spend a lot of time talking about him. His story is so interesting. We'll hear a little bit more about the person he was a bodyguard for later. But after there was a siege at St. Andrews, he gets captured by the French and is actually a galley slave for 19 months. He gets out of the galley slave situation. He goes to England under Edward VI, who you will see on our table is actually Protestant, so he was welcome there. But then when Mary came to the throne and she was Catholic, he was no longer welcome there, so he left. And among other places, he went to Geneva, spent some time with Calvin. And when he came back, it was 1559, and he wound up preaching here until 1572. He preached here for 13 years. You'll also see when we get to St. Andrews, he was very vocal about his opposition to the Catholic Church, and his sermons could often incite violence. So we'll come to that in a minute. So he was born in 1514. He died in 1572, and he was buried in the church courtyard. They had a graveyard, and then they kind of redid it all, and they kind of moved stuff, and so they don't know exactly where he is, but there's a marker kind of back there in the middle of the driveway, which is where they think he is. Yeah. Okay. If you go up to the top of Edinburgh Castle. So this is the other side of the castle that we saw from the back side of on the first picture. For your history buffs, this is Robert the Bruce and William Wallace. I won't use an accent. My wife said, don't do that. It would embarrass her if I were to do that. This is a giant cannon called the Big Mons that is up there.
Then you know he was wanting to use his Scottish accent.
I was going to say William the Bruce, but I didn't. Yeah, I just did. Okay. So we spent 2 days in Edinburgh, and then the third day we spent the night there, but we did a day trip up to St. Andrews. St. Andrews is interesting. It was actually and there's three things at St. Andrews. There's a castle, there's ruins of a cathedral and a priory, and there's a university. The university was founded in 1413 and is actually the third oldest English-speaking university in England, only behind Oxford and Cambridge. So in the 1400s, if you wanted like a really high-grade education and you wanted one in Scotland, this is where you were going to go. There was also what predated the university by almost 300 years. There was a cathedral that was started in 1160, and it took 150 years to build. They didn't get it built until 1318. Supposedly, Robert the Bruce was there when they consecrated it. Now, I mentioned John Knox. What happened was this and I'll show you pictures later in just a few slides, but what happened is this gorgeous cathedral was pretty much ransacked when Knox gave a very anti-papal sermon in 1559, and the townspeople just kind of went out and destroyed the cathedral. That happened a lot, especially in Scotland. Not so much in England, but in Scotland. All right, these are the first slides, and I apologize. I'll read this. Can you read this text, or is that too small for the back? Okay, let me read it. These are two markers that were both at St. Andrews. The top one commemorates someone by the name of Patrick Hamilton. I'll read it. The initials on the pavement nearby mark the spot where Patrick Hamilton, member of the university, was burned at the stake, February 29th, 1528, at the age of 24. On the continent, he had been greatly influenced by Martin Luther, and on his return to St. Andrews, he began to teach Lutheran doctrines. Having been tried and found guilty of heresy, he was condemned to death, thus becoming the first martyr of the Scottish Reformation. And there's some stones in the pavement, PH, that mark close to the place where he was martyred. Very close to that, there's a second marker for a guy named George Wishart. And I'll read that. A powerful Protestant preacher, he was betrayed to Cardinal Beaton, brought here, put in the sea tower, condemned for heresy, and burned at the stake on 1st of March, 1546. The lettering of GI, which I don't have a picture on the roadway, marks the place where he died. So these were two of the early Protestant martyrs who died in Scotland basically for their Protestant beliefs. It was at a time when, and we'll see on the table later, where Scotland was very Catholic. So they were going against the grain of the government and the religious establishment at the time. So this is the grounds of the castle, which sits right on the sea. It's in ruins. That's Sinclair Ferguson. He gave just a sweet, sweet devotional on John 17's Jesus' high priestly prayer, and how much God loves us and how much Jesus loves us because God gave us to him. It was just, and how his prayer includes us. It was prayer for future generations. We're in that prayer. It was very well done. This is called the Bottle Dungeon. It's shaped like a bottle, and it's what you got thrown into. The people I mentioned who died, both of them were probably put there for a while. The person who was behind killing Wishart, which was Cardinal Beaton, he was also killed, and his body was thrown in there for a year or two. He was assassinated a year or two after he killed Wishart. Now, Wishart's bodyguard, I mentioned that earlier, was John Knox. If you can imagine John Knox wielding a broadsword, and if Wishart got killed, why didn't Knox get killed? Well, Wishart kind of said, you don't need to be part of this, you get out of there. Subsequent to that, we have the dungeon, and we have the galley, and we have England, and we have so forth. But that's the Wishart-Knox connection. Let's see, where are we going here? Okay. So these are the ruins of the church of St. Andrews. Again, this is the one that was started in 1160 and finished in 1318. And there's a lot of people buried in this graveyard, one of whom, I may make this a question. David, you can't answer. Who is Samuel Rutherford? Anybody? No? Okay. So at the Westminster Confession, which we're going to get to later, there were 4 representatives from Scotland who weren't allowed to vote. They were observers. And he was one of those 4 observers. He lived from 1600 to 1661. And like I said, he went to the Westminster Assembly and advised. He also wrote a book called Lex Rex, which is on the divine right of kings, because his position was that the law should be king, meaning government, and actually above that, God should be king, and not that the king is law. Now, we kind of agree with that, but if you're a monarch, you're not a huge fan of that. And so Charles II actually considered that book to be treasonous. And he had set up to kind of kill Rutherford, martyr him, and he kind of passed away before he could pull it off. But Rutherford's important because we got some principles from him. He was a person who espoused limited government, he espoused constitutionalism, and he espoused resisting tyranny. And a lot of his thoughts actually influenced John Locke. If you know about John Locke, a lot of John Locke's thought is what influenced the founders of America. And it's been said that without Scottish Presbyterianism, we might not have had the revolution, or at least wouldn't have had the form of government that we have now. So Rutherford, Locke, American constitutionalism is an...
If I may, I'll go even one further. If it were not for Samuel Rutherford and Lex Rex, we wouldn't have a constitutional form of government. We would not have a representative republic. We would not have had the revolution, certainly in the sense that we had it, because of the principle of resisting tyranny. The other thing about about Samuel Rutherford, y'all perhaps have heard me talk about before, he wrote a lot of letters to people. And in one of his letters, he said, "The love of Christ hath neither brim nor bottom." So think about the coffee cup you're holding. The love of Christ hath neither brim nor bottom. It overflows and it's a bottomless cup. And he's also the one who said, there are infinite plies, P-L-I-E-S, there are infinite plies, or P-L-Y-E-S, infinite plies in the love of Christ. And if you want to know what a ply is, just look at the curtain behind you. Those folds are called plies. And he says there are so many plies in the love of Christ that we will never unfold all of them.
Think of plywood. Plywood is layer.
Like a layer, like a layer, yeah. Good.
Thank you, David. Okay, so we're going to keep moving here. So the next place we went, all right, come on. Why are we not going forward? That's interesting. There. So I mentioned St. Andrews, I mentioned the church and the university and the castle. Of course, there's also a golf course there. You may have heard about that. We did not play golf, but this is the first hole, and this is the famous bridge on the 18th hole in the clubhouse, and this is the beach right next to it, which wasn't where it happened historically, but it's where they filmed the beach scene on Chariots of Fire, on the white beach there. All right. Yeah, okay. Thank you. So our next stop was this interesting island called Lindisfarne, which is also called the Holy Island. It's a little island on the east coast facing the North Sea, not that far into England from Scotland. And what's interesting about it is it was founded by St. Aidan, who had come from Iona. There was a strong Irish Christianity from the monks, and they actually started sending missionaries to northern England. So from Iona, St. Aidan came in 635 and established this abbey, which you'll see in a minute, at Lindisfarne. And it was kind of a holy site, a pilgrimage site. People talk about it being connected to the mainland by a causeway. That's kind of a highfalutin. It's not a causeway, it's a road. that is sitting on the dirt, and at high tide it's underwater. So you can only get to Lindisfarne at low tide. You drive to it on the causeway and stay during high tide, and then when low tide comes, you can leave. What Lindisfarne is known for is it was the first place that the Vikings attacked with great force in June of 793. And this was kind of a shock to the Christian community in England because this was a holy place, it was a shrine, it was a place of pilgrimage, it was very wealthy. And they thought it was kind of protected because it was, part of their faith. And these barbaric Viking dudes came and just took everything. And they did that repeatedly. The other thing that Lindisfarne is known for is mead. We bought some and brought it home, but we haven't opened it yet, but we'll get to it. And what's called the Lindisfarne Gospels. These are Gospels that are gorgeous. This is from the cover page for Marcus. And it's all hand done. This is centuries before the printing press. It's all done by hand. The colors in here are from dyes that come from all over the known world, from like parts of the Mediterranean and Eastern Europe. And there's gold gold foil applique on these pages. Just a gorgeous, gorgeous document, which now sits in the British Museum in London. What year was that? They think in like the 700s-ish. Is that right, David? Yeah. So the Abbey was founded, like I said, in 635, and it was pretty much a monastery for 900 years until, as we'll see later, Henry VIII destroyed all the monasteries. There was a gap in there after a while of all those Viking invasions. They said, enough of this foolishness, we're going to just get out of here, and they did for a while. And then they came back and kind of refounded it. So it wasn't an unbroken 900 years, but a fair amount of those 900 years. There's also a gorgeous little castle there that some very, very rich guy turned into his summer estate. I mean, I wish I had a summer house like that. It's kind of cute. All right, next we went to Whitby. Now, Whitby is a Benedictine monastery that, again, like many monasteries, was dissolved with the dissolution of the monasteries. But the founder was King Oswy of Northumbria, and it was founded by an abbess, that would be a woman, who is variously called Hilda or Hilda. They started building it in 657. There was an important meeting that happened here. Remember I mentioned earlier that there was a lot of Celtic Christianity in northern England that had come from missionaries, Irish monk missionaries from Ireland. There was also a growing number of Roman, if you will, Christians who were coming into the southern part of England, and they disagreed on things we might not consider that important, but one of them was, when do you put Easter? So Whitby's important because in 664, they had a synod, and the Celtic and the Roman Christians got together and decided on a bunch of things, including that they were going to use the Roman method of finding Easter. And this is yet another one of those gorgeous churches that's pretty demolished. Didn't make it through the Reformation very well. All right, next we went to York. The York Cathedral, I think I told you St. Andrews took 150 years. Well, this cathedral took 250 years to build. They started in 1220 and finished in 1472. And it's huge. This is one of the city gates to York. Lynn and I had been there before, and we were a little disappointed that we didn't get to go in at this time, but that was okay because later they took us to a cathedral that's even bigger, which I'll show you in a minute. You can't go to York and not talk about the Shambles, which is this street that is much cleaner now than it was hundreds of years ago when it was where the butchers were. And if you can imagine animal carcasses and guts and you don't want to think about it. It's been cleaned up now, and it's got little bitty shops. This is a statue to Constantine, who actually became emperor in York when the other leaders of the Roman Empire at the time had passed away for various reasons, that he was crowned emperor in York. Of course, there wasn't a church there. It was hundreds of years before that, but they have that statue there. Okay. Then we went to a place called Boston. Now, Boston also sits down on the coast, and it has some interesting history about it. It's the place, if you can read this, I'll read this. In these cells, William Bradford, William Brewster, and others afterwards known as the Pilgrim Fathers, were imprisoned. 23rd of September, 1607, after attempting to escape to religious freedom. So basically, the Pilgrims, think of them, they were kind of pilgrims, Puritans/pilgrims, were just trying to leave England. They didn't agree with English stance on theology. And you would think they would just let them go. I mean, you disagree with this? No. They thought wrongly, and they needed to be punished because they were thinking wrongly. They couldn't just let them go. They had to be punished. So this group of people, they had secretly arranged to get on a boat with an English captain, and they were going to leave and go to Holland, which was much more tolerant. And the English captain turned on them and turned them in, and they confiscated them and wound up putting them in jail here. These are two of those little jail cells that probably, I mean, they're tiny, and they had like 8 or 10 people in each one of these jail cells. And they wound up staying here for 6 or 8 months. They did eventually get out. And about a year later, by another secret route, they managed to leave and go to Leiden, Holland for 13 years. And then they came back and got on this boat named the Mayflower. You may have heard of it. And then they came to America. But there was this bump in the road along the way where they were actually imprisoned the first time they were trying to leave England because of their difference in belief. The building is called the Guildhall. And it's not that impressive, but it's 500 years old. And just the construction inside, some of the wooden beams, it's just really, we could talk a lot about architecture, but we're not going to do that today. And so the other thing in Boston is St. Botolph's Church. And some people think that Botolph somehow got mangled enough to become Boston. I think that's a big stretch between, what do you think, David? Is that close? But the great joy was we were going to visit the church anyway, and it turned out the day we got there they had an organ recital. So we all got to sit down and have an hour-long organ recital in this gorgeous church. Okay, I told you that there was an even bigger church than York. It's at Ely. And this church, I don't know the measurements, I think it's like 1,000 feet from the front of the church to the back of the church. It is a large, large church. That is called the, I think it's the Lady Chapel, which means Mary. It's a Mother of Mary Chapel, which is also quite beautiful. Do I have anything more on that? Yeah, and this is probably a good place to mention this. You'll notice the more you get into England, the more that some of these old cathedrals are still standing, whereas most of the ones in northern England and Scotland are destroyed. That was because the reaction of Scotland was either Catholic or it was Reformed. In England, you had the Anglican situation. So some of the nice cathedrals in England are still there because they quickly converted to being Anglican, and so they didn't get destroyed. Am I making sense? Is that? Yeah. It was an interesting observation we made. Again, beautiful architecture. This is a very, very famous 8-sided vault. This church goes back, the actually monastery was founded in 673, but the church was built, I don't have the exact date, but in 1322, the roof over this collapsed, and they decided to rebuild it, and they wanted to do something magnificent. So the architects said, well, let's make it 8-sided. The problem is this span is like 74 feet, which is more than you can do with stone. So it's wood. It's 400 tons of wood. And the peak of this is 140 feet above the ground. It took them 18 years to make it. And they finished it in, what was it, 1342. So it's been standing for 700 years, almost. Okay, how are we doing time-wise? Okay, good. All right, so on the way to London, we went to Cambridge. And Cambridge and Oxford, if you're not familiar, they're universities, but within each university there's colleges. We tend to think of colleges in America as like College of Natural Science or College of Humanities or College of Math. Their colleges aren't necessarily limited to one discipline. It's just that college, and that's kind of where you stay. It's kind of where your friends are. It's where you eat. You'll have most of your classes there, but you can have classes in some of the other colleges as well. So that each college has kind of its own history and its own details. So for example, this is Queens College, and I know you can't see it because the letter's really small, but it's Queens, Queens apostrophe. The apostrophe is after the S because two different queens founded it. So it's not one Queens College, it's two Queens Colleges. And for us, the most important person we can put there is Erasmus was there from 1511 to 1514, and Erasmus made a very important Greek translation of the Bible, which was actually the basis for what Luther used when he wrote the German Luther Bible. He used Erasmus's Greek Bible, and Erasmus had spent time here.
Y'all saw my Instagram story from last week. You would have seen me reading from a first edition Greek New Testament of Erasmus at the Museum of the Bible. So it would have been one a copy, or and it was the same one that Luther would have had in his hands when he translated the New Testament into German. And I'd thrown that up on my story a couple weeks ago.
Some other, so that was Queens. This is Emmanuel College. It was founded in 1584. Worth mentioning three different people who came through Emmanuel. One was a man named John Harvard. You may have heard of the university he founded in Massachusetts. A lot of pilgrim leaders came through there, as did a lot of the translators of the King James Version of the Bible. St. John's College was, on all these dates, just blow me away. They're in the 14 and 1500s. We tend to think of things as old in America when they're 200 years old, and these things are 500 years old. So St. John's was founded in 1511. It has 12 Nobel Prize winners among its alumni, and also Wordsworth and a guy named Wilberforce, who was responsible for getting rid of slavery in England. Now, Trinity College, though one up some, Trinity was founded in 1546, and it has 34 Nobel Prize winners who went there. And a lot of them are in math and science. So if you have a math and science background, people like Maxwell, Rutherford, Bohr, Francis Bacon were all graduates of Trinity. It's considered the largest and the wealthiest college at Cambridge. And then lastly, we went to, let me sure it's lastly. Yeah, we went to King's College, which has the largest vault ceiling it's just gorgeous. It's up there really high and it has these fans. They call this a chapel. It's more than a chapel. It's a cathedral. It's giant. And at the very end of the chapel, it has its very own Rubens painting. Peter Paul Rubens has a painting at the head of the chapel from 1633. It's the Presentation of the Magi. We've probably seen it in like art history books. Yeah, that's good grief. That's right. Two of the graduates of this are Alan Turing and John Keyes. That's all of the colleges that I'm going to show you in Cambridge, but this was a little bitty church called St. Benet's, which is they say is the oldest building in Cambridge. And there was also a marker on a wall from a building that's no longer there, but the marker signifies the site of what was called the White Horse Inn, which came to be known as Little Germany, because Cambridge scholars would debate the works of Martin Luther there. And it was considered one of the Cambridge spots that was the birthplace of the Reformation in England. Now, I don't know how many of you heard about punting on the Thames. We didn't punt on the Thames, we punted on the Cam. That's how Cambridge got its name. It's the River Cam, and there was a bridge there, so it was Cambridge. And so these are little boats on, this is Jeannie Carroll again, and the water's shallow enough that these guys push you along with these poles. It feels very Old English. It's, very... So that was Cambridge, and then... And then we went to London. So this is the requisite Buckingham Palace. I'm always told, take pictures of us. My kids say, where are you? Well, I would take pictures of sites, but they want to have pictures of us. So this is one of the us pictures there on the right. Now, let me spend a little bit of time talking about Westminster Abbey and what went down there. We were scheduled to have a tour of the whole Westminster Abbey about noon. And within Westminster Abbey is a place called the Jerusalem Chamber, where actually, not at the very beginning, but for most of the 6 years, the people were to produce the Westminster Confession and the catechisms. So we did the whole church tour at 12, and at, I think it was 9:30 or 10, we had asked, could we be allowed in the Jerusalem Chamber? And most of the time people are told, no, you can't. But one of the members of our group wrote a very nice letter to the dean, which is like the head of the Abbey, told him our group was a bunch of people from Westminster and we were theological, and would he please let us in, and he did. So we went into the Jerusalem Chamber in groups of 15, and this is the place where there's about 120 divines who met over 1,000 times over 6 years, and any one time 60 to 80 of them met in this room and basically hammered out the Westminster Confession. These tapestries are 500 years old. They would have been much more vibrant and just gorgeous, but they've been fading for 5 centuries. And some of the woodwork has been redone, but I mean, that room, if you squared this room up, it's not even this big. Probably there was enough room in there for the clerk and the presiding guy to be at desk and everyone else stood. But we had a guide tell us about this room, and then Dr. Garner filled us in on more details about what had actually gone down here. So this room's importance is in this room, the Westminster Confession and the larger and shorter catechisms, which are what probably a couple 100 million Protestants around the world base their faith on. So it was a real privilege that we were allowed to go in there.
The importance of that room is that you're sitting in this room.
Yeah.
Because in 1973, when the PCA was formed, the PCA attached itself to the Westminster Confession and larger and shorter catechisms. If you're an office bearer in the PCA, an elder or a deacon, you subscribe to the Westminster Standards. And so they were written in that room. And so there is a very real sense in which, were it not for what took place in that room, we wouldn't be sitting in this room right now.
Yeah. It was really, really special to be able to be allowed in there. Just some sightseeing pictures. That's Trafalgar Square with a Nelson Column monument and Big Ben and a lion from Trafalgar and a bust of Churchill. And then these are pictures from the actual, the formal tour that we did later in the day at the Abbey. And there's something like 3,000 either graves or grave markers in the Abbey, and they're kind of grouped by topics. So you have scientists here, and you have authors here, and you have. So I just picked a few. This is Lewis. This is Newton. This is it's called the coronation chair. It's where all the kings of England since like 1296 have been coronated on. Coronated crown. That's a word. Coronated on. It normally has a 330-pound rock from Scotland under it, but the Scottish people wanted it back, so they have it unless there's a coronation going on. Well, most of the time it's in Scotland.
It's important to note Lewis isn't actually buried there. He's buried outside of the little church he went to in Oxford, but that's called Poets' Corner, and they just put a little, memorial of him there as an important literary figure in England.
Yep. So the last day, the last full day there, we went to Oxford. And Oxford, like I said, is a lot like Cambridge. It's a university. It has a lot of different colleges. This particular street looks pretty nondescript. These are just planters in the middle of it. But if you walk down to about here and look between two of those planters, you see this in the ground. And what is that? That is the marker for the place where 3 people were martyred. Two of them in 1555, Nicholas Ridley and Hugh Lattimore, and then Thomas Cranmer in 1556. And again, if you'll see very shortly when we get to the page here, that was because they were Protestants and they were now under the reign of Mary, who was a rabid Catholic, and she started bumping off people who were of the Protestant persuasion. This is probably as good a time as any to give a plug for this book, Fox's Book of Martyrs. Now, I had heard about this before, and I think I've heard David say that a lot of people hundreds of years ago would have 3 books in their home. They'd have a Bible, they'd have Pilgrim's Progress, and they'd have Fox's Book of Martyrs. The reason this is important is there's like 300 pages in here, and in the last 10 or 20, you get a very detailed account of what happened to these three people. And the very start of it, you get an account of James and Stephen going all the way back to New Testament times. And in between, there are 200 or 300 pages worth of other Christian martyrs who have all died for their faith. I'm talking hundreds. So one of the appreciations that I could say Lynn and I got from this trip, that I can't speak for her, but I certainly didn't have it before the trip, was how much people have suffered, even in countries that we would consider tolerant, England, Scotland, for their faith.
Jeff, if you permitted one more time, when we were over there, Lydia, we found 3 people, Korean man and 2 Korean ladies, and they were playing guitars and singing worship songs. Lord, I lift your name on high, just, contemporary worship songs. And they were standing right beside that, right on top of that martyrs monument, which are just bricks in the middle of the road, laid out in tile work like that. Lydia joined them and started singing. An hour later, a Pride Progress parade marched right over the top of those bricks.
Yeah, so there's this marker in the ground, but if you go back the road, I don't know, like a quarter mile, there's a much larger martyrs monument than this marker that's in the road here. Yes?
You want to hear a Christ Press connection?
Sure.
Our first pastor, Cortez Cooper,
Yeah.
here, not in this room, but in the sanctuary, was the gym, baptized Hugh Latimer's descendant, who was a good-sized little baby. He's 40 now. And when he picked him up, he said, Hugh Latimer, sturdy child with a covenant.
I like it. I like it. Yeah. I think we've got time. Yep.
While you're looking that up, when they were there on that very spot about to be burned alive, Nicholas Ridley said to Hugh Latimer, who was nervous, obviously. Oh, bad, my bad.
Okay, I'm going to read you out of Fox's here. Dr. Ridley, so Ridley and Latimer are both getting ready to be killed here. Dr. Ridley then requested of Lord Williams of Fame to advocate with the Queen the cause of some poor men to whom he had, when bishop, granted leases, but which the present bishop refused to confirm. A lighted faggot was now laid at Dr. Ridley's feet, which caused Mr. Latimer to say, "Be of good cheer, Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day, by God's grace, light up such a candle in England as I trust will never be put out." I was going.
And then your Cortez baptizes one of his descendants.
Yeah.
So it's true.
Yeah,
It didn't. Said in here.
It didn't go out.
The handle didn't go out.
Yep. Okay, so moving on in Oxford, I'm just going to show you two. Sorry, how did we get there? Just two colleges in Oxford. The first is what you would think is Magdalen, wrong, Magdalen. It's Magdalen. And this is where C.S. Lewis spent most of his time. This is the Magdalen Chapel. This is the cloister. These are, oh, it smells so good here. What were these, honey? Wisteria, I think. I wish you could take a picture of smell, because, you know, it was really good. And that's the outside. And then the other place, as David says, if you haven't watched Harry Potter, you need to repent. Okay, so if y'all all have seen Harry Potter, this is the actual steps. We're on the middle of the first movie. Professor McGonagall is welcoming the students. They actually did film it there on these steps. When you go through those doors, you see this hall. Now, they didn't use this hall, but they used that as a model for Hogwarts Hall. So there is a Hogwarts, Harry Potter, Christchurch connection there. Okay. The thing about Christ Church is there were 13 prime ministers and other people who you would know who spent time there. They didn't all graduate. Lewis Carroll, John Locke, Einstein, William Penn all went here. Okay, now, I got 15 minutes. All right, we're going to do this. So now you've seen all the sites. So now what I'm going to try to do is go back and do a chronological thing to kind of put the pieces together a little bit better. So we're going to start with the ancient church. The ancient church in the 600s, there was this early missionary activity which came, a lot of it from, I said, Ireland. They sent people down to Lindisfarne, started that Celtic mission, St. Aidan, the Lindisfarne Gospels, Whitby Abbey, the Synod, all that was like 600s. So that was the earliest things that we saw on our tour time-wise. In the medieval period, a lot of these cathedrals that we saw that were just gorgeous were started anywhere in the 11 to 12 to 1300s, so that's when they dated from. Oxford and Cambridge, as you heard, most of the colleges at those two places were like 1500s. And now we get to do the handout. Oh, lucky day. Okay, pull out your handout. Now, here's the reason why I gave this, why I made this. I've been always confused about how to put together what's going on over there in the Reformation. And you need a grid to put that stuff on. And I think the best grid is to look at the kings of Scotland and England and look at what their, if you will, their religious proclivities were. And then on that framework, talk about a lot of the things we talked about today. So looking at your handout, on the left side, we have the Scottish kings. We started in 1548, James IV, who was Catholic. And after that was James V, who was Catholic. And it was under James V that first martyr we saw was martyred, Patrick Hamilton, 1528, the 24-year-old who had gone to Germany. After that was Mary, Queen of Scots, who was also Catholic, 1542 to 1567. And even though she was Catholic, and there were people martyred under her, like George Wishart, that was also a person under whose Scottish royal reign John Knox had his ministry. So there was, as you imagine, there was a little tension there between John Knox and this Catholic monarch. When, after Mary, Queen of Scots, you had the Protestant James VI, who from 1567 to 1603 ruled just Scotland. I'll go to the other side of the page. In England, we had Henry VII, who was Catholic, Henry VIII, who started out Catholic, but when the Pope wouldn't grant him his divorces, he founded the Church of England. And shortly thereafter is when he demolished the monasteries. Now you might ask, why did he do that? Well, he had a couple good reasons. One is the monasteries were very rich and they held a lot of power. And by dissolving the monasteries, he got that money to the crown, and he also was able to reward all of his loyal subjects and lords and princes and earls with money and land. But that's the time when which basically the monasteries in England vanished during the dissolution of the monasteries. After him, Edward VI, who was the son of one of his Protestant wives, started to institute Protestant reforms, but he unfortunately died when he was 16. So after he died, you had Lady Jane Grey, who wasn't even in power for less than a year, and then Mary I, who let's just say was a rabid Catholic. And so because of her rabid Catholicity, people who had been practicing Protestantism under Edward were persecuted. And that's when Ridley and Latimer and Cranmer were killed. So that's the grid that kind of makes sense of that. After Mary, which was only about 5 years, Elizabeth came into power, and she reigned for almost 50 years. She did restore Protestantism, or at least Anglicanism. But when she died, the person who assumed the throne, both of Scotland and England for the first time, was this James VI. So James VI of Scotland became both James VI of Scotland and James I of England. And from that point on, we just have one ruler of both. Now, that James, let me go to the next page, that James is responsible for the King James Version. It's good enough for him. No, I won't go there. Some of you grow up, but never mind. After that, we had Charles, who was Protestant, who was High Anglican. Under him, we had a lot of stuff going on in Scotland. We had that National Covenant. Remember the thing that got signed at Greyfriars back in 1638? That happened during that time period. There was also a lot of unrest in Scotland because of the difference between the religious factions there. But that's also under Charles when the divines met. Now, higher up on the chart, I mentioned the 39 and the 43rd articles. Those were attempts by the Church of England to come up with their doctrinal statements. And originally, the Westminster divines were supposed to just kind of massage those a little bit. And David, maybe you could speak. That they wound up doing a whole lot more than that. They wound up coming up with the entire Westminster Confession and the catechisms. Then we have a period of time when there was no king, the interregnum, when Cromwell, who was a Puritan, ruled for 11 years. What's interesting about this is, as far as we can tell, and I think I'm correct here, the only time that the Church of England adhered, well, the only time that the Church in England, let's not call it the Church of England, the only time the Church in England adhered to the Westminster Confession was during the interregnum. It's called the interregnum, which is the period that Cromwell ruled. So even though the Westminster Confession was done in the Jerusalem chamber, it's only really followed for just this one little window, if you were in England.
That's because the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, was sort of ruled with a set of more Catholic beliefs, and then Cromwell came in, and then they reversed. Is that what happened? Or?
It was that. It was also the fact that the Church of England was the official church of the government. Well, you don't have a king. I mean, it's the interregnum is the inner kingship. It's between kings. Charles I, Charles II. And so you have a brief period there wherein what we believe and practice as Protestants was freely preached and taught. And Jeff, if I'm about to steal your thunder, just cut me off, but when Charles II assumed the throne and the regnum, so to speak, was reestablished, kingship was reestablished, Cromwell is out, the Puritan project is over by 1680. There was the 5 Mile Act passed, wherein all Puritan pastors that maybe you've read and heard of, you know, Thomas Goodwin, John Owen, Thomas Watson, John Flavel, different ones, were told that you cannot be within 5 miles of your parish. And so they would have to go out into the woods and into the forests and out to preach and teach their people. But over 2,000 Puritan ministers on pain of imprisonment were run out of their churches when Charles II came back up. And that effectively shut the Puritan project down. And at that point, many Puritans, as well as Scottish Protestants, went to the Netherlands for safety.
And the other thing that occurred to me that I left out, if we go back, is one of the other dynamics is the Protestants, because what we talked earlier about Samuel Rutherford, tended to think in terms of, you know, the supreme leader is not the king, whereas a good Anglican would adhere to that. So one of the big differences that developed between the Protestants and the Anglicans is how they viewed kingship and who was the ultimate, whether it was the king or whether it was law and God above that. There's a big difference on the two sides.
Was the Episcopal the same as Anglican at that time? No, I know it's all different now, probably not conservative.
I'm trying to think of a short answer to that. Episcopal relates more to the polity of government, meaning that there are bishops involved. Is that fair to say that?
Yeah, and so the Episcopal Church, or the Church of England at the time, would have held to the 39 Articles, which we would agree with the 39 Articles. The difference between the churches, the Church of England and what were called the nonconformists, was that the Church of England believed the king was the head of the church. The nonconformist Puritans believed that there was a different king who was the head of the church, and his name was Jesus Christ. The Church of England now would have no commitment really to the theology of the 39 Articles,
right,
and has become, you know, exceedingly liberal and dismissive of the Bible, just as the Episcopal Church in America has, which is why now you have what is called the ACNA, the Anglican Church of North America, which in America over the last 25 years has been more conservative, Bible-believing Anglicans having to leave the Episcopal Church in America. The problem was there was no Bible-believing bishop that could be over them, and so for about 20 years they had an African Bible-believing bishop
From Rwanda.
over the Anglican Church of America. So theologically, the Church of England now is not even what it would have been then in terms of its adherence to the 39 Articles.
Yeah. So I guess the last thing I wanted to do, I'm going to buzz through this and go to just themes real quick. In trying to summarize what Lynn and I got from this trip, the first two, I don't think are as significant as the last two, but the first one was there's a huge interaction between politics and government and the church, and you see it very clearly in that table I showed you, for example, probably not more clearly than anywhere else. The second is, I could have gone down the architecture road. You can just wax eloquent about Norman arches and Gothic arches and pointed and, gorgeous stuff, but I think the most important thing that I learned personally was about martyrs and persecution, and that is, I had no idea before this trip that our heritage includes so many men and women who died for their faith. And I'm talking people in Scotland and England who died for their faith because they had the audacity to believe a Protestant view as opposed to, say, the Roman Catholic view. And I think we had a copy that we lost. I bought another copy, a new one, and Lynn and I are working through this, but this is very motivational just to read about what these forebears in the faith went through. And the second thing I'd say that was important is some of these churches are absolutely gorgeous, but you don't have a sense always. We were in some very cool churches. The church that Sinclair Ferguson preached at on the Magnificent Mile, St. Columba's, was like right on. A lot of these other cathedrals are gorgeous. I mean, ornamentation and gilding and stained glass windows and architecture. You don't necessarily have the same sense that this is an alive place. So I think I just came in with 2 minutes to spare. I would be glad to answer any questions. I might not be able to do it, but we have a minute or two if anyone wants to ask anything. Or David, you want to make any other comments?
I want to just say one thing here about why this matters, why church history matters for why we are where we are right now. We talked about, the Westminster Confession. You saw the picture in the room, and where the martyrs were burned, and the fact that Cortez Cooper baptized a descendant of one of those martyrs who was burned there. We're in this room now because of that room that we saw. So when Jeff alluded to this earlier, and I mentioned when the Roman Catholic persecution in Scotland sent Protestant believers to the Netherlands, Church of England persecution sent Protestant believers to the Netherlands. So I was given these books. So Kevin Schwitt had like a record swap yesterday or something, and because he collects, vinyls, and somebody traded some books to him for some records, and Kevin said, I don't read Dutch, I don't have any use for these, so he gave them to me. So, and my point is this is dogmatische Studien geloof in rechtvaardiging, the doctrine of right standing, the doctrine of justification. Geloof in Volharding, the doctrine of perseverance. Geloof in Heiliging, the doctrine of sanctification. And then De Sacramenten.
Sacraments.
Okay, this author is a Dutch theologian, Dr. G.C. Burkhauer. Now you may think, what does that have to do with us? How does this connect with us? How many of you have heard of the book by R.C. Sproul? All right, many of y'all have heard of the book by R.C. Sproul. He did his doctoral studies under Burkhauer, and these are first editions. And so the fact that the Protestant faith and Reformed theology, in kind of a tidal wave of people trying to escape persecution, made it to the Netherlands, you wind up with someone later in the 1900s becoming a theologian, writing, some guy from Pittsburgh goes over to study, and y'all have some of Sproul's books on your shelves. So the way these things are woven together, this stuff really matters. It's not just dates and slides. We wouldn't be here right now. You see these multi-tentacled connections.
Okay. I'm going to close this in prayer, and we can stay and talk if people want to. Father, thank you for today. Thank you for the privilege it was to go on this trip, but also just to open our eyes to your people, your servants, your men and women, and what they have suffered for you and for your truth and for your word and for your Son over the centuries. And I pray, Father, that that would be a motivation to us to also live for Christ in every aspect of our lives to the people around us who don't know you. In your Son's name, amen.